one or three of us, and nobody was going to take them off.
Okay, we're going to jump in. So welcome to Community Conversation number 3. Our topic tonight is MTSS, Multi-Tiered System of Support, and Early Release Wednesdays. This microphone is live, and hopefully we'll capture what's going on in the room. I can hold it and pass it around if you'd like, but it will also catch it if we just leave it in this spot too. All right, so go ahead, Jen, if you want to make minutes. Just a couple things to begin. These are generally informal presentations. We want to make sure that there is time for you to ask questions, receive clarifications about the topics. If there's time left over at the end, we can talk about whatever topics you would like to talk about. These are just some general norms that we like for some of these conversations. Particularly, just, let's try and stay focused on what it is that we're doing. And again, if there's time at the end, we can alter that focus to be whatever you'd like to talk about. And this is our general structure. We have about an hour. We have 2 short presentations, one by Dr. Payne, who's going to talk about MTSS programming. We have a couple spaces in the middle of this, of her presentation, and the one I'm going to give about Early Release Wednesdays, where we want to stop, let you ask questions, offer clarifications, give us feedback, that type of thing. So kind of interspersed along the way, we'll sort of stop and then have a conversation, if that works. And then these are our 2 topics. So without ado, I think we're going to jump right in. Dr. Payne, it's all you.
So good evening, everyone. Patrice Payne, thank you for coming. I'm just here to share the work that we're doing regarding our MTSS structure. And so just to be clear, MTSS, which stands for Multi-Tiered Systems of Support, is a framework. And so this framework suggests that in order for all students to be supported appropriately, and this is Gen Ed students, then there should be 3 systems, 3 tiers of support available to them. And so what I want to share, and I hope you'll see as we continue talking, is that MTSS is for 100% of our students. And so the majority of our students will be receiving support in Tier 1. And when we say Tier 1, basically that describes what happens in the classroom. And so in the classroom, instructional strategies and interventions to support students with learning and achieving expected outcomes should be able to happen in Tier 1. But what happens when students do not meet those expected outcomes in the classroom is we advance them to Tier 2. And that is where they are able to receive support that is beyond classroom instruction and classroom interventions. And so typically, you would see not even more than 10% of students who would need Tier 2 supports, because generally about 80% of our students should be able to be supported in a Tier 1 environment, which is in the classroom. And then what happens when students aren't responsive to those Tier 2 supports, then students advance to Tier 3. And as you know, following those 3 tiers, that is when we have discussions about potential special education placement, because students have demonstrated that they have greater need that exceeds those 3 tiers. Thank you. And so if you're just wondering, well, what does that mean when we say Tier 1 in-classroom support? Here is like a long list, which I wouldn't dare read to you, but these are long research-based, this is a long list of research-based practices that are helpful to students in the classroom. And so just one thing that I'll point out that I just glanced at is key vocabulary is emphasized, reviewed, and presented prior to the lesson. That's called scaffolding. So realizing that some students may not have the same academic vocabulary, one way to help them have access to the content is if you preview or you front load vocabulary. And so that's one example of what Tier 1 support looks like in the classroom. And so I'll stop there. This was just a very broad overview of what we mean when we reference MTSS. Are there any questions about those 3 different tiers? Yes?
Are the 3 different tiers handled by the in-classroom teacher?
Tier 1 is completely handled by the in-classroom teacher. tiers 2 and 3, those are extensive supports that go beyond the classroom. So what that could look like is content area intervention occurs, or that could be a check-in, check-out with a member of our guest teams, which we'll talk about also. Those are people, guests, G-E-S-S-T. And that's a group of people in our student services department. It's comprised of counselors, deans, social workers, school psychs, and those people support and champion students who are placed in tier 2 and tier 3. So those are beyond the classroom supports.
And then how does that kick in?
How do students access
tier 2
those supports?
Yeah, how and when does tier 2 kick in?
So we're actually going to get there. Do you mind if I?
Not a problem, I'm sorry.
No, you're okay. No, you're fine. Yeah.
I just got one question
Sure.
as far as when these interventions occur, are they taken out of classroom to do that?
So when we think about opportunity costs, that's a difficulty that happens in secondary education. We just don't have the structure in our day that allows for academic supports. Come on in, you're fine. That allows for academic supports unless you take something away. And so sometimes, and it is our last option, but sometimes we do have to pull students so that they can meet with an interventionist. But ideally, if we're able to pull students from study halls, from Excel, then that's another option. And you'll also see a few slides later that in our content area, a lot of interventions happen when our interventionists push in to classrooms. And so you may see students who are in a small group receiving additional supports. So it can look differently.
But in tier 1, we're not pulling kids out.
Oh no, tier 1 is just classroom instruction.
Because they're in the classroom.
They're in
That's right.
Can't pull them out because the teacher's not working with them.
As far as opportunity costs go, are you measuring once the students are pulled from class, how much classroom time is lost, and how are they recouping that instructional time?
Yeah, so, and this is, I know that these questions are really good, and it's my hope that it'll make more sense as we talk more about it. So there's a champion model that we have, and so every student who's identified based on indicators that we've described, and maybe, Jen, can you try the next slide? I wonder. No, it's not it. Oh well. No, this is good. But each student who's identified, those students receive a champion who supports them through a 10-week cycle. And so what that champion does is, that champion not only checks in with that student, but also serves as like an advocate for that student. And so when students have to be pulled, which is our last option, something that frequently happens is, those champions will email the classroom teacher and say, hey, this student is really struggling right now. I'm going to set this student up with a period to have interventions occur. And if there's anything that this student can do to make up this work, or if there's anything I need to work on to help that student, then, you know, those kinds of conversations happen. It's really collaborative. And I'll tell you very frankly, I was in an MTSS Illinois network meeting, and MTSS really lends itself to elementary education. So if you think about it, elementary students, they're in one class the entire day with that teacher. And so there's a lot of flexibility when different supports can happen. Well, we have a traditional schedule, 7 50-minute periods. And so unfortunately, in order to provide those intensive supports, sometimes, which is not the ideal option, you have to pull students. And so we make sure that we're as communicative as possible.
Your question raises an interesting point, though. We should probably make sure to say, MTSS is not something District 86 invents.
Oh, no.
Right.
Yeah.
RTI was a way that we talked about this before. It also had 3 tiers. It was a pyramid.
Mm-hmm.
You know, MTSS is another way to talk about it. There's a network of teachers. Almost every district, and sometimes even every building inside of a district, will have an MTSS person who coordinates those types of interventions. So, you know, I guess sometimes when we're immersed in it, we don't think about like some of the other pieces, but this is a state, if not national, sort of system, and the language that we're using is very common.
And just to give context, I guess I should have said that this was a direct response to being more responsive to students. So to prevent us from identifying students to have to receive special education services, there are a lot of things that we can do preventatively that could support students who would otherwise have been labeled inappropriately. But this allows us to have documentation, this allows us to have different layers of support to ensure that when we do identify students, we're identifying the appropriate students with benefit.
So the students that students that you have identified could potentially not be special ed students. They're just okay.
Yeah,
In most systems, you go through all 3 tiers
Mhm.
before you even recommend a
That's
student
right.
for special education.
so when you recommend a student, the first question is, well, what supports have you provided the student? Show me what you've done over what amount of time you provided these supports. How did the student respond? Was the student not responsive to those supports? And so then you can continue to have that conversation. So this allows us to be proactive and preventative in a way. Yeah.
But it doesn't affect the kids coming in with
No.
service, support. Yeah. It's just,
Yeah.
it helps you not, potentially,
Over-identify.
not identify the child as special ed because you provided the services.
And to give students what they need before we start having a conversation about whether or not they actually have a disability and
Mhm.
qualify for special education services. Like when you look at the Illinois criteria to identify a student as having a learning disability, you have to show evidence that you have put interventions in place and what students' responses to those interventions have been. So that's part of that eligibility paperwork.
And so here I'm just showing you what our intervention inventory looks like. So when we identify students, which I haven't forgotten your question, when we identify students, these are the types of supports that are available to students. And so students would have collaborative conversations with their champion, and they would talk through what would best benefit you. What do you want to try? Here's what I suggest. So this is just a list of our inventory.
What's the CICO?
Check in, check out. And so the frequency that students receive is completely dependent on individual students. Some students may benefit from daily check-in, check-outs with that champion, while other students may need a weekly check-in, check-out. And those conversations can span just talking about personal life. It can be grades, grades check-ins. It can be SEL check-ins, and so it varies. But that's what CICO stands for. So here's the answer to your question. So how are we identifying students? We developed 3 indicators that we are using to identify students who need Tier 2 and Tier 3 supports. So the first is, if a student has less than a 90% average daily attendance, that's one indicator. The second one is if students are failing 2 or more classes. And then the third is if students, and this is based on PSAT and SAT scores, if a student is below grade level benchmark scores. And so here you can see, these are our actual numbers. You have Central and South represented. These are the numbers of students who hit 2 of those indicators, and these are the numbers for students who hit all 3. Yes,
Go back, I can go back.
I have a question.
Sure.
You said you use PSAT scores and
SAT.
SAT scores, which those tests are taken in what grade level?
So they're taking 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th.
So they're
specific-
taken in the fall of ninth or the spring of
They
ninth?
take them twice a year.
I know,
Yeah.
so in the fall?
Yeah.
So if they're, okay, and then the absence rate, it's like, is one, do you first look if the absence rate is done, or if they're, which one is the priority? Is there a priority in these?
No, we
Or are
don't
they all
filter.
looked at the same way?
Yeah, they're equal.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just want to clarify, we did not give the PSA 9
Yeah.
and
That's
9 and
The
10
fall.
in the fall this year. We did the year
Oh,
before.
for this year, yeah.
We-
So then how will this year's classes know whether they need supports or not?
So we also use an alternate testing system, the MAP test, which we do give to everyone in the fall of every year.
Okay.
And we have cross-reference numbers that let us know what students are and are not meeting benchmark standards on the SAT based on their MAP scores.
And just to
Okay,
be
so-
clear,
so
these
Matt
are the
is-
students we focus on. we don't just focus on students with, who hit all 3 of the criteria, but actually we focus on students who hit 2 of the 3.
And then the freshmen will come in with their 8th grade math scores.
That's right,
Yes, okay. So then, yeah, okay.
And so
We have multiple points for every kid, but it's an important thing.
Yeah.
They're not one score. No kid is one score.
Yeah.
We're looking at multiple different points, especially to identify them for a further intervention that may pull them away from their class.
Yeah.
Want to make sure that they are hurt.
Well, because I'm looking at, when I was on the board, we had a management report on a monthly basis, and we were told of these numbers on a monthly basis, based on classroom scores and things like that. So that's, and I believe frequency is the key to helping.
Yeah.
which
Real-time
scores
trend
did you,
analysis.
Pardon me?
which scores are you?
It was, well, during the months where the testing wasn't, it was the actual classroom scores.
Gotcha.
And so every teacher gave us a report, and the administration wrapped it all up for us, so we knew where kids were, whether they were on grade level or not, at the month that they were.
Mhm.
Is that something you guys are doing? Are you doing that essentially a real-time trend analysis, so month to month or week to week?
Yeah, so.
And that's helping determine what's needed?
Yeah, so we have a development team, and I'll share what I've been sharing with the team. In my previous district, I coordinated MTSS, and so one thing that's really valuable to that process is having a universal screener that you can use for progress monitoring purposes. And so that's one thing that we're talking about. And I want to be very clear, it's not that that's the right answer, but it is a great data source. And so the team and I, we just have to keep discussing if this is right for our students, because I will say this, grades, attendance, and test scores are sometimes just symptoms. And those are usually symptoms of engagement issues, belongingness issues. And so there are times when just constant testing is not always beneficial either. So it's a conversation, and I think it's an important conversation to have.
Right, and then there was just another question that I had really quickly.
Sure.
Because I asked this at the last community conversation, and because I feel that it's after Columbine, we were very well aware that each and every student needs an adult connection
That's right.
within the school. Is that happening? That's what I'm concerned about.
Mm-hmm.
Is that happening, and how can we make, I don't see how it can be done, because everybody's being asked to do everything plus the kitchen sink,
Yeah.
so I just truly believe that each and every student has to be told that they're valued, that they matter, no matter what they're doing. If they're
If
not,
they have all A's, every student needs a champion, right?
right, A's don't matter.
Right.
It's like, and plus with COVID, we know that we have students,
That's right.
we have students that are now, they've taken over parental responsibilities. And and I know that gets past the MTSS, and I apologize for getting off topic, but I'm kind of passionate about this, that we've got to look at what are we doing for those kids, because they're not high school students anymore. They are parents that are going to high school that have to fill out their high school years because they're not 18 yet.
Right.
So I'm sorry.
No, you're okay. I will just say this. One thing I was really happy to see, and this has nothing to do with me, it already existed, but both campuses have what's called relationship mapping. And so they actually take the time to make sure that every student is connected to an adult. And this has nothing to do with MTSS. This was just recognizing the importance of relationships. So, yes.
Thank you.
And also, yes, we do have a regular weekly data input. It's called a stoplight report. Right? And which doesn't make sense because there's green, yellow, red, and blue. And blue is and it's based on grades and attendance. And we're now producing on a weekly basis and putting in the hands of teachers and department chairs so that they can pull out the kids who are red, right? Or at least have an individual or separate contact. That's the goal. But it is relatively new this school year. All right, we're taking away
I'm
from
sorry.
you, Patrice. Go ahead.
It's okay.
Champions.
I'm sorry?
Oh, we're gonna get to that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So I just wanted to share with you how powerful this work is. So what you're about to see are a few slides, and I really just want you to see them. I'm not going to go through them. But these are examples of student responses. So our South team did pre-cycle surveys. And so they gave students about 10 questions that asked students, what are you really proud of thus far? How do you feel about your grades? How are your relationships with your teachers? What more support do you need? And so just take a second and you'll see how students are responding to these questions. So if you look at this one, I thought this was really telling. I am happy with my current performance in school. You see where most students answered honestly and reflectively, and then I can benefit from the 10-week support. You can see where most students responded. So here's an example, and then Jen, there are just a few more slides.
What's the population that was taken from? How many students?
This was a group of our Hinsdale South students, and so,
50, right?
I'm sorry. What'd you
You
say?
okay?
It was
The
50,
50?
right? Because you had 50.
Yeah, now all 50 did not
Okay.
complete this, so there's autonomy with our champions, but this was a good way to know where students are starting. Some students sometimes prefer to reflect individually and kind of share these responses. Others can have those conversations.
So, sorry, can we go back to that graph?
Yep.
Sure.
Oops, sorry.
So was this group those who taken from tier 2 and 3 students, or is this just general population?
No, these are all of our identified students who hit 2 or more of those
Okay.
criteria.
That would help to qualify that before, that those answers make more sense then.
Yeah, but
Versus
these
saying
are,
that this is not,
so now
not
I'm
general
only,
population,
yeah,
this is just those who are targeting. or
I'm only talking
qualifying.
about our students who are being championed.
Okay.
Yeah. And so here's another example. So what are you proud of thus far? I made varsity chair, being social. Honestly, don't know. Some of my grades. So these are just examples of how we're getting students to think about their actions and how we're getting them to think about the positives to hopefully leverage more improved outcomes. Here are some goals. What are some goals you would like to have at the end of this 10-week cycle? C in math, to get my grades up, pass all of my classes. So these are just examples. And then, what can I do to support you? Weekly check-ins. They can explain better what they're actually asking me to do for the assignments. And so this is just good information to have that champions can then kind of relate to teachers that could be beneficial. Any barriers? Some people say no. One honest person said my phone is a distraction at home. And then this one I thought was really great. Myself. I need to just do my work. Attendance. So you see a lot of good reflection happening. So, any thoughts, observations, or questions just from those last few slides showing student responses?
Can I look at the graph again? The
Sure.
bar chart? Sorry.
This one?
So the question, I'm happy with my current performance in school. I can see, even if you ask the general population, I don't know that the bar graph would look any different. And this is why. We're trained as humans to never be satisfied, to always be, working, growing. So it's hard for, especially a student, to feel satisfied with their performance or anything, right? Because you're always trying to grow. It would be interesting to see if we could phrase it, or if it was phrased a little bit differently, to see if their responses would be the same. Because that's a general, I don't know anybody that can say they're happy with the performance in any one piece of their life, totally, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's just,
Yeah, that's good feedback, but I want to share with you, and I think Chris is taking notes, so that's really good feedback. But I want to share with you that this question was very intentional, and I'll tell you why. There's an assumption that if you have a student who has who is truant, if you have a student who is failing 3 to 5 classes, if you have a student who is below grade level, you may assume that the student is checked out and the student doesn't care. But when you can get students to answer reflectively and honestly and say, I'm not happy with my performance, and I'm not talking about students who are successful, who are on board, I'm talking about students who are not doing well and probably haven't been doing well for a lot of years. That answer is very telling, and it creates an opportunity to kind of dig in and get that student on board and to see that you are in the hole, but it's not impossible. And so just the admission that they're not happy with their performance, I think is a good starting point for a conversation and to kind of speak life into kids and say, hey, you have 5 Fs right now, but let's get that down to 4, and then we'll work to 3. So, yeah, but that is good feedback. Hey, so here's the guest structure. So again, when I'm mentioning guests, I'm talking about our student services team members who serve as champions to our students. That includes our counselors, deans, school psychs, sometimes nurses when it's appropriate. Am I leaving anybody out? Social workers, yeah. So it's a huge team of people, and we have developed a 10-week structure. So MTSS, the framework of MTSS, espouses that in order for interventions to truly be assessed, they should last for 6 to 8 weeks. And so our cycle altogether is 10 weeks because we incorporated time for collaboration within this cycle. And so here's a midpoint guest meeting that occurs and an end of cycle meeting. And that's so important because collaboration is key. And so it's a good opportunity for people to share information. How's it working with your student? What's something that you're trying? Or I'm hitting a brick wall and me and my student are not meshing. Can you help me out? Or do you have a better relationship with the student? So that's why we've expanded to 10 weeks. And so here's what I'm really proud of, and it has nothing to do with me, but it's our guest team. They are amazing. And I will tell you, it is not common to have these types of results in one cycle, and we're not finished with our first 10-week cycle. We're at about week 7. So how are we doing at South? So we identified 57 students. You'll realize that the number's higher than the original slide, and that's because they identified some additional students who didn't hit those indicators, but they had some SEO concerns that they saw in their everyday experiences and encounters with students who were added. Of those 57, 40 were championed. Here's all the great news. Look how many students' grades of those 57 students have improved. And when I say improved, that means the number of classes they were failing reduced. And you'll see that not only did 35 students' grades improve, 10 are currently not failing any classes. We have 5 students who we can't identify the growth, and that's only because they didn't have starting grades. Or those students may have been placed in a different program, which we would not count with our
It doesn't sound
We don't know.
good.
I will let somebody know. Yeah.
It sounds like water is
That's,
leaking.
it sounds
Oh,
like
that
water's
sound.
leaking, yeah.
And then I say no improvement yet. And so there are 14 students whose grades are the same, or maybe they're failing and struggling in a bit more classes. And so I say no improvement yet. And then you'll also see the attendance data.
So are grades the only metric that you're following to define improved?
So we have grades at the top, and then we also have attendance here.
And how much improvement? Can you qualify that?
Yeah, so I was originally sharing that students' number of failing classes has decreased. And so that ranges, those 35 students, they have either decreased the number of classes they're failing by 1, some all the way up to 5 classes that they're no longer failing. And as you can see, 10 students aren't failing anything.
So, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Dr. Pavina mentioned there was already a program like this essentially in place versus what we've tweaked here. Have you guys been able to show the difference between the two programs?
A program existed, are you talking about
So
RTI?
if MTSS already existed and has been in place at in the district for some time.
I can-
No, that is not accurate. MTSS has not been in the district in
So you
this
had,
way.
you mentioned that, you said earlier that there was a similar program in place before. That was a
RTI. You just
RTI.
refired.
I wasn't saying that this district had been practicing this type of program, that it has existed. I believe I went to Northern as a first-year teacher to do a professional development meeting about the new thing called RTI, right, which was this, right, and now it's called MTSS. What I'm saying is that this has been in place for a long time. Our district has not used our guest teams, and maybe we should introduce everyone who don't know. This is Jen Regan, she's our director of guidance, social work, counseling, everything, right, and is like in charge of the guest program here at Central. Right, and we have been using sort of a recommendation system. So the person who had the ability to get on the phone and say, my kid really needs help, that kid got served, right, first. And that wasn't always the kid who was falling behind, falling through the cracks, not coming to school, right? They often had a parent who was like so on top of things that they said the school's gotta be doing something about this, right? So this database system with these 3 criteria is new this year and falls more specifically under what we would call a traditional and research-based MTSS system. So that's what I meant. So if I misspoke, I apologize.
So you had an intervention and support system of some kind in place before, yes?
Yes.
Are we measuring that, the success of that or the results of that against what you're putting in place now?
Well, they're apples
To
to
determine
oranges.
whether one is better or worse than the other.
Well, with one, we weren't serving kids who were really falling through the cracks necessarily, so we can't really compare the two.
Define that.
I get on the phone, you call, and you say,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, every week, so here at Central, and it's similar at South, we would meet weekly, 2 teams. A team is made up of 2 counselors, social worker, counselor, dean, and school nurse, and then we have a student support coordinator. And they would meet every week, and just kids that popped up on their radar, whether, we would get a weekly report of how kids who are failing. A dean would know about attendance, so people would bring different maybe data points, but nothing that like really brought to light like multiple issues with a kid. So some of these kids were falling through the cracks. Maybe a teacher reached out, a parent reached out, and so then we would just put kids on an agenda and we would talk about them as a team. And they might get supports, they might not. It might just be kind of more of, hey, this is what's going on with this kid. There was no necessarily, we had a lot of these similar supports available, but there wasn't like a structured system where somebody would be responsible for making sure that this kid was getting supports, tracking the data, and evaluating it after a set amount of time to see like, is this working for this kid? If not, what else can we do? So we were just kind of throwing a lot of stuff at kids. A lot of times it did work, which is why the system worked somewhat for us, but we didn't track the data like this because we didn't have the data to start necessarily. We weren't using data to define the kids, so there was no data necessarily to track. If that makes sense. So it would be hard to compare them because while they were servicing kids, it wouldn't necessarily be in the same manner.
For the same student. Because you-
Potentially, yes. I mean, we are seeing that a lot of these kids, when we pulled the data the first time, and we're coming on the end of our 10-week cycle, and we'll look at some more data at our next set of meetings, that a lot of these kids are kids that were on our radar with issues. So, yeah, we weren't missing all of these kids. But, our hope is that we're catching some that we were missing.
So we don't even have general data to say we were able to serve X amount of kids in the previous 5 years?
Oh yeah, no, we tracked like who we served and things like that, but we weren't looking necessarily at the data in this same format.
And
We definitely tracked who we were serving.
Is there similar data that you can correlate between the two to tell whether you're actually driving improvement or not?
What did you pull from the kids? Did you look at
Previously?
grades? Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, I
I
mean,
get
it
the
would
intention behind the
depend,
program.
right?
Okay, you're trying to drive
Yeah,
kids
no, for
improvement.
sure,
I just want to understand, are we
Yeah.
actually looking at it in a way that's,
right.
are we measuring the differences between the two? Understanding that obviously one likely has more data than the other.
Right.
But it is actually getting the outcomes that we're looking for.
Well, rather than comparing the two, we just said outright the other model wasn't doing what research says we should do. It wasn't doing cycles, it wasn't cracking kids, it wasn't offering a champion that was gonna look after a kid for multiple periods of time, it wasn't triangulating the data, it was a referral system that was working because many of the referrals were well-intentioned and made in good faith. This is a system that we will be able to track over time because we have a specific set of criteria, we have a specific cycle. We'll as soon as week 10 is up, we will move on to second cycle using the exact same data set and potentially even keep some of the same kids who were not as successful. You know, those 35 kids or the 10 with no failing grades, they should fall off. Yeah, those right there, they may stay, you know, so again,
Is this
apples and
program
oranges comparison.
defined upfront for parents coming in? So
It
they
can be.
understand?
Yeah, I mean, it can be, but
I would think it should be.
we are talking about less than what percent of kids?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we absolutely, we're doing it right now. We're saying this is what we do. When kids are failing multiple grades, and they're not, their attendance isn't there, and they're below benchmark standards.
That
This
seems
is what
very
will
back
happen.
of the napkin, not a formal policy that this is what we're trying to hand out.
There is no policy. This is just a procedure. It's a practice. We do have policy related to this. Is we will create systems that serve the needs of students who are not meeting graduation requirements. I mean, anything within the sixth section of instruction, you know, related to students failing courses hits on this. This is the procedure that we are using right now to make sure that fewer kids are failing, more kids are engaged and in class.
And just
But
one
this is
thing.
the first 10 weeks.
This is the
cycle.
first,
I mean,
yes.
this is the first run.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's brand new.
Yeah.
Yes.
And one thing that I wanted to share is there's a small group of us who are working to, in fact, memorialize the work that we're doing by developing our MTSS handbook, which is that Illinois MTSS network that I mentioned earlier. That's why we're a part of it, because developing that handbook is no small feat, and so we want to memorialize all of the work that we do, and we want to make sure that people have access to the knowledge of this type of support that's available.
So, one thing, and it's just probably, it may be something that bothers me, but maybe it's something to consider, the numbers don't reconcile on the slide. So, like,
It's not just you.
okay, it just,
Are you saying
the numbers
this
don't
document
add up.
doesn't
What
match?
happened to 17 being identified and championed?
No, but
Yeah.
also, like, in the groups, the South grades, 35 improved, 5 are NA, 14 no improvement. It neither adds up to 57 or 40. Do you understand? So like, it would be great to be able to, do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I know
Yeah.
I'm being picky, but it's just something that
No.
for me,
No, and I'll tell you what's been difficult. So there's a reason I put identified and championed, because I want to be as transparent with you as possible. So when we get our data reports using those 3 indicators, the number that we got for South was 57 students qualified for 2 or more of those. But the purpose of our guest teams is these are people who are hands-on, they're in the trenches, they know these students. And so there were a lot of instances, and if you think about it, this is our first 10-week cycle, so this started really close after the school year started. There were some students who were out of town for like the first 2 weeks of school. Those students don't necessarily need a champion. Those students have just been out, they need time to catch up on their work. There are some students who had surgery. And so those students, of course, they were rostered, but we didn't champion those students because those students expressed, oh, I'm fine, or I'm in Excel. You know, so there are other supports. So I want to be very clear, you're not going to see the numbers kind of representative of these 2 numbers because there are different instances there are different buckets of students who we're talking about. But I did want to share, this is what it looked like when we went through the data of our original list.
so if this is presented elsewhere, because it took, you know, like the explanation.
Yeah,
I would just explain it,
yeah.
like the data.
Yeah.
So I have another question.
Sure.
This 10-week cycle, the new MTSS program, right, support system, how does this play in terms of scheduling? Because, you know, PTAC went over block scheduling, which, again, I'm supportive of. The only concern I have is freshman hours. I'm not sure they're mature enough to sit for that long in the classroom. But Because you expressed some concern about pulling kids out, missing instructional hours. Would this be part of the 8th period? Or am I not, are we not talking?
No, we can. I would like to, can we move to the next, I think that when you talk about what interventionists do.
Oh, there's still more.
Here, oh yeah, there's still more. There's a whole other topic that we should have started maybe 15 minutes ago.
I'm
sorry.
So we're gonna get there. Let's talk about this.
Okay.
Kat, to answer your question, if we move to a schedule that has another period in it, it is possible that period could be used to do specific interventions, right, for these pullouts, so that there is less time missed in class. That is absolutely 100% goal of having that additional time. What Kay and championed before about having personal contact can be done through an advisory or a homeroom, where you have that one person you go to that does not give you a grade. They are just there. You're their person that they go to every day, right? That could be part of that schedule too, right? We presented all this, and I wasn't there, but the team presented all this to our staff today, right? To talk on one of our it was an early release day today.
Oh, lucky you.
Yeah, there's a big part of that. But anyway, so yes, it certainly can be. Right now, our schedule has 0 time in it, none,
Right.
right? Unless you give up a class to have any intervention thing happen, right? It's just the way it's been built. It's been that way for years, decades,
So why not change it?
We're talking about it right now. It's a very large conversation.
Change is challenging.
Change is very challenging. But go ahead and talk about this. So we have interventionists.
Okay.
We talk about them all the time, but this is kind of what they do.
Yeah, so if you just want to glance over this just gives an idea of what happens in the different departments and how they serve students. And so this is ideal when we talk about students not missing instructional time. So that's why you see a lot of our departments, they're intentional about having that push-in time where they're actually able to come into classes and work with students who teachers have expressed could benefit from additional support. And
But this is not tier 3. I mean, this is
tier
not
1 for
this
any
is not what we've been
student.
talking about. This is just everyone else who might be struggling.
Yeah.
Once the classroom teacher has exhausted almost all of those bullet points in that way earlier slide, then we move to pulling in somebody else, right? Or pulling the kid out.
It's like pre-tier 2.
It's pre-tier 3.
Oh,
Yeah.
Yeah. Some students just need in-time support with a particular concept. And so this is how students and teachers are supported in that process. And so then I want to make sure that we highlight Central's work. So our next slide. Jen, do you want to brag on your good news?
Yeah, so we identified 43 students at the beginning of the year. We did end up championing 21 of them, and the big, as Patrice had said earlier, we talked about, when we met in our teams, we talked about all 43 kids. And we talked about why they were on the list for, why maybe they were failing, why their attendance rate was the way it was. Those were the 2 things that we kind of know a lot of information about. Obviously, we don't know a lot necessarily about their test scores. But in a lot of the cases, in almost half of them, we were able to identify something, like either they were, as Patrice had said, maybe they didn't start school on time, or were out for COVID, or some other reason where they missed a whole week of school. And because of that, they were temporarily failing classes, right? And these were kids who were typically 80 students, so we knew they didn't need a 10-week intervention. We had some kids who were already getting a tier 3 support, and so they didn't necessarily need that individual champion because they were getting daily support either through Excel or Excel 3. So we had 21 kids who weren't getting some other support or needed additional support, so those kids were championed. And then, as you can see, their grades improved. Currently there's 17 that have no failing grades, so they're getting back on track with their grades. Their attendance has improved for those kids that were on there because of attendance. And we, as you saw the cycle, we'll be wrapping up our cycle next week. So we'll be looking at all of these kids. We re-looked at the data. We re-pulled the data at the midpoint cycle and looked at it. And a lot of those kids who were receiving supports were no longer in the, on the report is needing that support, but we're continuing it. And then we'll evaluate them all next week at the end of our cycle. And probably, 6 to 10 kids will move on to some other support and stay within that cycle. And then we'll look at new data. And we know that we'll have new kids that we haven't supported yet.
Like during the midpoint, these 10 weeks are for these kids, or what happens if a child 2 weeks into it, is just tanking? Do they have to wait the 8 weeks until this cycle is done?
Yeah.
And I'm sorry,
No,
I'm
you're
sorry, I'm
okay.
asking the world of you and of all the teachers, but does it need to be thought of as like something that's rolling?
Yeah.
And I know this is just the first year, and it's.
And it's our first cycle. And
Yeah,
these are all
that's-
things,
and that's right.
when we met at our midpoint, we also did some kind of reflecting on how it was going. We met this week with a couple of the teams and we talked about some of the things that are going really well, some of the things, and at the next week when we meet for our 10-week cycle, we'll talk about some of those things and we will tweak things. We know we will because this is our first time.
Right.
But in general, we feel really positive about it. It's helping us, again, identify kids. It's helping us look at, more of, instead of just, a lot of these supports we've had in place, but we're making it a more formalized system and tracking our data, which we know is important so that we can see the growth in the kids and know that what we're doing is working. And so, we will. Our teams do still meet periodically, and we're structured in our new space in a way that the teams are grouped together. So as things are coming up with kids, the counselors are still looking at their weekly failure reports, right? And I'm seeing those kids that are failing multiple classes. So they are still talking about those kids, absolutely. As a team, how they're gonna support this kid. So it's not like we just are only supporting these kids. We're supporting lots of kids every day. Yeah, and I know you're not saying that,
I
yeah.
wasn't trying to ding you or ding
No.
anybody about that, but it's just ever since
Yeah,
I've dealt with administrations, back when the kids got in kindergarten, so we're talking many years.
Yeah.
This is that freshman students, only freshman year, where all the adults, you guys get redos every year. I'm concerned about that freshman kid, or the summer kid, junior, they don't get to do-overs, because it's frowned upon to do over. You kind of move them along. And so that's just what I'm very concerned about, and I know all the teachers and staff are concerned about that too. I'm not trying to say that, it's just, sorry.
no, you're okay. Go ahead.
2 questions that are kind of intertwined. Did you guys define why the gap between the 21 and 43? What defined a kid that was one was champion and one was not?
Yeah.
And what was that criteria?
Well,
And then it
what
sounds
we discussed each kid, and if they were already getting a tier 3 support, those kids weren't necessarily.
Aren't all of these three are all of these kids the qualified kids that have met all 3 requirements?
Yeah, so Jim made the point earlier that this is like the start of the school year. So we had students, for example, who were out at the start of the school year. So that student will automatically hit those 2 indicators, attendance and grades.
Okay.
But those students don't necessarily have that academic need for a 10-week cycle. Those students just needed time to catch up because of surgery or because they were out of town. But we still keep them rostered, and I know that our guest team members, whoever is like that student's counselor, I know that they still check in on those students.
Yeah, for sure.
We have them on the reports, the midpoint reports, and I'm positive that some of those students that we're referring to are a part of that improved group.
Did you want a second question?
Well, you said that there may be other kids that are still falling outside of this and not being identified because you said that there are other teachers or whoever that are still making recommendations that are on the radar outside of this. So are there still kids falling through the cracks that aren't being identified by this? So going back to the old system, right, it was the
Yeah.
recommendation system. You just said
Yeah.
a minute ago that you're still getting that feedback from those stakeholders, making recommendations. So
Yeah,
is there
I
still kids
mean,
falling, that
Yeah,
are getting missed just like they were getting missed before?
so like a teacher might see something going on in class or have a concern, they will still reach out to the counselors, social workers. So those things are still happening.
Okay.
Counselors are still meeting outside of this within their team and supporting kids in different ways. So again, these are not the only kids we're supporting. We're just supporting these kids in a very systematic way.
Can
Yeah, go
I want
ahead.
to be respectful of everyone's time. I just realized it's 7:52. Chris has a whole presentation.
Oh,
no.
Yeah, so this is where we are with Central. And then I think we can skip the rest that's there. Jen, can you keep going? This is just on the horizon. These are systemic equity gaps that we are now looking into now that we have the systematized structure. Next, Jen. I think you've been doing questions throughout, but I encourage you, if you have any other thoughts, please feel free to email me and we can be in communication. Chris, I'm not going to say another word, your turn.
One comment in transition, if there are kids who are still falling through the cracks, there are fewer of them, right? Because this system is designed to catch more kids than the system we had before, right? And we will only know that based on the data that we see as we continue to go along. My guess is if we pull this every 10 weeks, right, and we're looking at championing somewhere in the neighborhood of 25 to 50 to 60 kids on each campus, that's 25 to 50 to 60 kids that we weren't even touching last year, right, in a systematic way. Right, so I'd like to say the answer is 100% no. No kids are falling through the cracks. That's not practical. What's practical is to say we now have a system in place to catch the kids who might have been falling through the cracks before, and we're working very hard on that. Okay.
Can I ask one last question?
Yep, go ahead.
Have you guys done any sort of cost analysis of what you were doing before, that cost for students as they go through the different tiers versus what the projected cost of this is?
No.
How are you budgeting toward that?
It's in the existing budget. We haven't changed, we haven't added teachers, we haven't changed time. The guest team that used to be doing the sort of on-call is now doing targeted intervention.
So this is new time that
No,
either
this is-
administration and or teachers are,
No, it's just, it's time used differently. It's repurposed time.
So the work that our guest team members were doing last year, they're still doing that work. They're doing it with the students who are identified through our data reports. So the work hasn't changed. It's just making sure that we're doing it with the students with the greatest need according to their indicators.
And they still have a day job. They're still counselors all day. They're still working with kids. The deans are also working with kids. Everyone still is doing their job. We're just doing the part of it that is the most intervention, tier 3, differently, right? With a more targeted approach.
and cutting classroom time for this?
I will try and move through this. I want to be respectful of all of our time, and since Grandma's watching my kids at home. So here's where we were, just to shift gears. This was a long debated Board of Education topic. This is what we were saying, and I just want to provide some insight as to where we are, what the data is telling us now about early release days. I want to be really clear. We have absolutely zero recommendation, right, for next year, right? And we're not even talking about what we're doing for release time for next year because we're in the midst of this longer discussion about our entire schedule. And if you were at the last community conversation, or at PTAC, or have been following along by watching any of the videos, you know that part of that conversation about the schedule is trying to create embedded collaboration time inside the school day so we don't have to pull kids out of class. Because one of our #1 priorities is increasing instructional time. All right, so here's what we said. We're going to take 18 late start days and 6 flex days and replace them with 15 early release days. That was the goal. Our original plan was 30, that was too much. 15 is where we settled. We said we wanted to have a consistent daily start time. One, in order to reduce tardiness to period 1. We wanted consistent class period time. If you remember in last year's, anyone who had a class during lunch period on a shortened day had 50 minutes where their other classes were like 30, 35 minutes. So teachers were planning very oddly throughout the day. We wanted to extend collaboration time so we could accomplish strategic plan goals, to meet with multiple course teams at a time, because almost every teacher is on 2, if not 3 or 4 different course teams, because they have different preparations during the day. We wanted to reduce pull-out time, right? Time that teachers were pulling out of the class in order to do that curriculum work. We wanted to maintain whole district opportunities for PD, meaning ways that we could travel back and forth, right, and do that whole work, and we wanted to increase instructional time. And this schedule actually puts 8 hours back in over the 21-22 schedule, right? So we did increase instructional time, right? And we're trying to do all of these, and actually, I will just sort of like not bury the lead. All of these we've accomplished, right, with the schedule thus far, right? But I just kind of want to go through them. One added benefit to all of this changes, there's this new block of student opportunity time that we just didn't have before, that we've now been trying to utilize for student opportunities. So we'll talk about what those are as well. This is the instructional time. You've seen this chart before. This takes us back all the way to 2016-17, where we had 1,024 hours of instructional time a year and 18 collaboration hours built into the school day. That stayed relatively consistent until we started our strategic plan. You'll notice a year is missing in here, which is the COVID year, where everything went completely south for everyone, so we skipped that one, right? But it did drop, right? So our goal with any new plan was to get it back up again, which is that 8-hour add. Now, this is the idea here. We are in a construction year, which is super weird, right, for all sorts of reasons. If we were to do this exact same early release schedule in a normal year with no construction schedule, we actually would be at 1,015 hours of instructional time with the same number of collaboration hours, because there are just more days and fewer half days. So one of the things that we're staying on is more instructional time is better. One of the questions was asked, can you reduce pull-out time by having these early release days? This is our initial data on that. In 21-22, we had, per employee, almost 12 periods pulled out of class to do staff development or instructional time. That's not the early release time. That is just the pure, like, I didn't go and teach my English class and a sub did it that day, right? That came to about 2.39 days per employee. This is not new information. This was presented to the board last spring, right? What we're now looking at, just to give you where we are right now, from September 7th, our first day of school, to November 15th, yesterday, right, we are at 2.3 periods per employee, or 0.46 days of pull-out time. And if you extrapolate that over the rest of this entire school year, the remaining days of our 179-day school year, at the current pull-out rate, we will actually be at half of the rate for 21-22 in both categories, right? So if you ask the question, are we doing better with not pulling teachers out of class? The answer is yes. And one of the reasons is because they have these extended blocks on Wednesday time to do a lot of the work they were pulling out for. One of the questions was, how's the attendance? Because the attendance was atrocious, as we showed, on all late arrival days, right? Kids just wouldn't come, or they were super tardy. Well, if you take a look now, we have about a 94%-ish daily attendance rate. That's every day. That's our average, right? If you look at just the early release date so far, it's actually higher on the early release days. More kids come to school on early release Wednesdays than on every other day of the year. I don't know why. Maybe it's because it's a shorter day of school, very possibly. As far as tardies are concerned, we, in the month of October, which is the only full month we can actually calculate right now, because September was not full this year for us, but it was the year before. November is not yet done, so October is the month we're looking at with a 10% decline in tardies to period 1 on both campuses during this October compared to last October. Right? And then as far as discipline is concerned, we've talked to our SROs, and they've reported there have been no additional incidents that they could tell us, have been happening because students have been released early. That was another one of the concerns. One of them, tongue-in-cheek, said, people can't find a seat at the corner bakery on a Wednesday afternoon in downtown Hinsdale, but other than that, there have been no concerns that have been presented. What are teachers doing? Because remember, the original reason that we wanted to have these early release days was to give teachers a little bit more time to collaborate. So, they're lesson planning, they're lesson adjusting, they're looking at assessment criteria and assessment creation, they're doing data review, they're sharing best practices, they're discussing all those tier 1 interventions that Dr. Payne had up on the screen in that first set of bullet points. And when we talked to the teachers, because we had a couple focus groups, right, we asked, how's it going? Teachers generally are saying that work for them for collaboration is better in the afternoons. And for one really specific reason. It's that when they did it in the mornings for that 1 hour, they were always thinking about what am I going to do in period 1. right? What copies do I need? What do I have to put on my Canvas page? There was always this like pull towards their students. Whereas with these, they finish the day and then they move into their collaboration teams, right? And with these, we can also have more of the cross-district stuff like we had today. Everyone went from this building over to South, met as whole department, whole program teams before they heard a presentation about the potential for a change schedule. One of the things though that they're saying that's a negative is that by having it every 2 weeks, it's reducing the consistency that they need to actually meet with their teams. They really liked it when it was once a week, right? But they do like the idea of it being in the afternoons, right? And they like the idea of having enough time to meet with multiple teams, right? Because when you have only 1 hour, you typically will meet with your one team. So if I'm an English teacher, I teach English 1 and I teach film and lit, right? Right? So I can't meet with the English 1 team for 45 minutes and then go meet with film and lit. I gotta wait till the next week. But in this scenario, you can meet with film and lit and English 1 because your department chair will coordinate when teams are meeting on those days. So they do like that. What are we doing cross-district? Are we still making progress on our professional development goals? The answer is yes. These are our 3 identified professional development goals for the entire district for the year. The first one is assessment literacy. If we are not good at writing assessments that are standards-based, that we can reflect back on and then provide kids really detailed feedback, we're not writing good assessments. Right, so we're getting better at that. That's 3 specific days during the year. We're going to spend 1 day, which is probably not enough, sorry Patrice, on culture responsive education pieces, although Patrice is conducting monthly bite-sized sort of lunchtime PD sessions, kind of part of that whole infusion into the school day piece that are voluntary, though dozens, hundreds, how many came to bite-sized PD?
We were at 94.
94 of our 280 plus teachers. So a lot of good response for some bite-sized PD, which happens during lunch periods. Right? And then finally, we're actually going to do an SEL showcase. You know, we have all of these lessons that teachers, that students get through their PE classes, particularly when they're freshmen. So we're going to talk about how teachers can potentially share what's happened in their classes and then figure out ways to embed SEL and other pieces into some of the existing curriculum. All right. How are we doing on our strategic plan work? Well, this is where we were last year. Right? This is the percentage completion. Completion means that we have all 7 of these areas aligned. Right? 100% means it's fully aligned. Right? On a separate page that feeds into this, every department chair is in charge of each course in their department. So in social studies, we will have all the courses, and if they have code, they get a 2 means 100% done, 1 means in progress, 0 means they haven't even started yet. And those all turn into a calculation for each one of these, which then appears here as the overall status. So you can see where we are, overall status right now, as compared to at the end of last spring. So the work over the summer that teachers did, right, as well as the work that they're currently doing, sometimes with pullouts, sometimes in the afternoons on these days, right, is making very significant progress over time. Right, and we'll just continue on. We have about another 1.5 years left on the strategic plan work for curriculum alignment, mostly, as you can see, in these areas. Course objectives, unit alignment, and end-of-term assessments. And this is being fed, for the most part, by the professional development that we're doing on a regular basis with the teachers through the assessment literacy. Now, what are the kids doing? We opened up all these opportunities for kids. Did they take advantage of them? Not really, right? About 337 kids so far have stayed on the 4 early release Wednesdays. And here's what they stayed for. About 25 of them stayed to make up a test. Another 25% stayed to meet with support services of some kind, sometimes even with their champion, right? They accessed quiet study spaces and just stayed, right? Students with IEPs, about 13% of the 337 met with their case manager. We have a full complement of NHS tutors at the ready that are chomping at the bit to help kids, and very few show up, but the ones that show up get a lot of help. About 7% of that total number met with an NHS tutor. We have some content area teachers that we actually provide compensation for them to work through their lunch, and some of them have taken us up on that. So they are available to work for an English, Math, Social Studies, all the content areas. We have group study areas that are open. I think it's actually the library. That might be a quiet study. And then about 4% are doing other, like staying in Excel. These are kids who have a credit recovery class during the day, and then they just stay that extra time and just keep going. Right? So there are some that are taking advantage of that. It is important to note that like, as the year started, right, very few kids came, but over the course of the last 2 weeks, the number who stayed doubled, right? So we'll see how that trend persists. You know, are more kids going to stay now that they need to make up tests, they need to see teachers, they need help? We don't know, but we do know that it's nearly doubled over the course of the last 2 as compared to the first 2. Right? And I don't know what happened today. And then coming soon, we will start in January, we're going to have SAT prep opportunities that will be available for our targeted students, meaning students that are, or did we choose approaching? No. We chose, yes, students in the approaching category. So when our data tells us, based on an SAT or a PSAT report, that a student is in the approaching category, which means they're about 5 to 7 questions away from hitting the benchmark, right? They fall into a very small sliver, right? But we have about 25 to 35% of our students who fall in that very close mark, right? So we want to make sure those kids get a little tiny extra, right? Because the other students who are really not approaching are actually being served by other remediation areas, right? So we're going to start this in January of 2023, and that's generally what's happening with early releases, at least what we know to date.
Of the count of the children, 337 and
Yep.
377, are those unique or are those
That's
just
total
count?
district. When,
But it could be the same student coming each early release. That's all I'm asking.
you know, it could be. It could be. We have set up 2 systems, one in each campus, that kids sign up and check in for the things that they do. So I actually don't know if they are repeat. They could be repeaters.
Well, and that's,
Yeah.
you know.
From
could be.
like, you mean like
Yeah.
from 1 week to the
Yeah.
next?
Somebody who's come all 4 weeks.
That
Yeah.
they're really
Yeah.
taking responsibility for their, for themselves.
Yeah.
And that shows such good fortitude for them. That's all I'm looking for.
I did an interview for this Hinsdale South newspaper about a month ago, and the student who was doing the interview asked to meet with me on an early release Wednesday afternoon. And I thought, oh, that makes sense. She's probably just going to stick around, and be in the building and do something in that time. And I met with her at I think it was 2:30 or 2:45, something towards the end of that time. And I pulled up to the building and I walked in at the same time she was pulling up to the building and walking in. And I said, oh, I thought you would stay. And she actually said, no. With these early releases, I now go get a couple hours of work in. Like I have a flexible schedule and I do 2 hours of work now on Wednesday afternoons that I wasn't doing before, right? So it's just an example of ways kids have sort of figured out what they're gonna do on those afternoons that might benefit them. I would like to think that there are more of them doing that than hanging out at home playing video games, but I can't be certain of that as a fact. So, thoughts?
You said that there was no negative feedback.
I did not say that, no.
That's
Right.
essentially what you said earlier in your presentation.
Well, I'm just showing you what the data said. Yes, all the data is positive. The negative feedback has been, right, that there's no more
I didn't
consistency.
see any feedback from parents out there, because from the parent that I talked to about this, it's the dumbest decision this district's ever made.
And why do they say that? I'm really curious, because this would say that it's pretty smart. So what is their evidence?
Unmonitored children in the middle of the day.
Okay,
How the parents that
Who are
working-
doing- okay.
The parents that are working,
Yeah.
which is I would say, majority of the district,
Mhm.
what are they supposed to do? How are they supposed to get those kids home? Who's monitoring those kids for the half of the day?
Okay, well, we are talking about,
Consistency in schedule.
right.
Complete interruption in the middle of the week.
Okay. We will be
I'm just trying
resurveying
to tell
for
you
sure.
that there's none of that information in this presentation.
I fully understand. I was looking at the goals of the program. Based on the goals of the
I
program,
get the sales pitch.
yes.
It's not necessarily presenting what the community's real feelings are on it.
Okay, well, please share those. Give me some more.
I'm one person.
Well, you're actually right now representing everyone who's talking, so I would really like to hear it, because this is where we get to talk about.
Has there been a feedback from
None.
the parents to the district about early release Wednesdays? Maybe that's what he's trying to get at, is maybe there should be some kind of
How many letters to the board?
survey.
How many negative letters?
Sure.
So not a single parent has written to you in
I have
a negative
heard of-
fashion,
I
or the
have-
board.
No. To my
That
knowledge,
this
no.
is not a good idea.
Since it passed, no. I don't get all the board emails, but typically the ones that are related to things that I do are forwarded to me, and I've received none.
more? Or-
No, I'm good.
So with regards to early release Wednesdays, improvement would be probably to offer food to the kids that are staying after 4,
And it is, every time.
but not the food.
Different food? What food would we offer?
Uh,
Oh, okay.
Pizza or something, but something.
Oh, you mean provide food to the
Yeah.
kids?
Like buy food out of,
I don't know, but, you know, because you're targeting, anyhow.
Mhm.
So, with regards to the kids that are targeted, and I may have missed it because I came late, I apologize. We have demographics on this.
For tier 1, for Dr.
For,
Baines?
you know, all the data that is reported is, or, you know, we have the demographics on kids.
Sure.
I mean, that would be useful to understand too, because then you'll understand that there are other circumstances, right? So I have a general question, because I sit on PTAC and other things. So early release Wednesdays are for currently MTSS, right? Like collaboration or how would you get it?
For teacher collaboration.
Okay, so early release Wednesday, teacher collaboration. And then MTS, so this is just a hypothetical. If the district were to move towards block scheduling and possibly a period with the MTSS and supports and stuff like that, then like the anchor day or early release Wednesdays or whatever would be the collaboration time. Have we, so my question is, have we estimated based upon different models, the instructional hours per year for kids?
We haven't got that. It would be a goal
Yeah,
if our teachers association is in support to move forward by looking at a couple practical models where we could then say, there will be this many instructional minutes, this is how we'll do collaboration, this is how a release period might work, this is how eighth period, the eighth block might operate, right? But we have not gotten there yet. We are still in the early research phases. Oh, go ahead.
I wanted to actually answer some of your questions
Oh,
from a parent perspective. The feedback I have gotten from my own children and from people, their friends and my friends, is we like the early release Wednesdays. We prefer it to the late start Mondays, for exactly the same reasons that you highlighted here. It was disruptive to the sleep schedule for the kids, people were late, they forgot it wasn't a late start Monday, and they would be stressed out coming into school, that's how they started their day. I think a lot of kids might early release Wednesdays. My daughter actually took advantage. The counseling department offered help from the counselors for college
Oh, that's it, right?
applications.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, the best thing that they've done. I wish my boys had had that when they were here. She got feedback on essays. She got feedback on her applications. It was great. So to have that time that doesn't take away from either coming in early, and some percent early birds can't come in, or late because people have activities, this was time where she felt like there was time that she could use that didn't take away from activities or job or school. So that was great. The other thing is a lot of kids that took, they love just that break. If in the middle of the week, it is so stressful that just to have that little bit of a breather to maybe have lunch at Corner Bakery before they go back to the jobs or back to these 10 hours of homework, they love that. I think where you can, something that you're missing is time with teachers. I know that you said that you have a few people that can be helpful. I know that one of the girls I spoke with was, my teacher said I need extra time. She planned it on right after release on early release Wednesday. This girl didn't feel stressed out about missing a bus, missing an activity or whatever, so she actually liked that. And that's my comment, because I know it's hard sometimes to get help from teachers. They don't necessarily have to be here before 8 o'clock. And I know sometimes kids have come in and their teacher isn't there yet. And a lot of these kids or teachers have activities after school, so they can't get to their teachers then either, or a job. So if we could have 20 minutes after early release Wednesday, that teachers are available so that kids can run into help, I think that is an opportunity that we really should capitalize on. So the feedback I've gotten sort of mirrors a lot of what you were presenting tonight.
Would you mind pulling up the, I respond to that. Can you pull up the graph of the instructional hours again?
Sure. Right here at the beginning.
Yep.
This one?
Mm-hmm.
So we're still 6 years in, and we're still lower than we were back in 2016, 17,
Well, 6 years into,
this graph. So there's a decreasing trend here.
that's correct.
What are we doing to turn that around? And what do we think we should be at?
Well,
So I understand the 180-day calendar is what it is.
right.
We're in a post-COVID era now.
Mhm.
You've got 10 years of kids coming through the system with massive gaps in learning. Is this trend something that you can continue? So you're talking about hours on the market, right? So you switch some days around, you got 8 hours back.
Mhm.
Is that truly impactful, and how do you quantify that?
So
Yes, your statement is correct. You increased hours.
Yes,
What's the impact of that, and how are you measuring it?
I don't know. How would you suggest that we measure it? We would see
I
test
would
scores
generally
increase?
say
We'd see more student engagement?
performance. So, I mean, you just look at your South report cards. Is 38% proficiency good enough?
No, it is not, which is why we have a number of programs in place to increase it.
Okay.
Yeah. 8 plus another 7. I don't know what will be after that. Block schedule puts, I don't know, 27 to 54 hours depending on the number of passing periods that we don't have for kids. If we move to that, we are at the top of instructional minutes for high schools around. And one of the reasons for that is that we have 4 additional days. Most high schools are.
Benchmarking yourself against other schools in Illinois is not necessarily setting the bar very high.
Well, I would put us against schools in the nation. We have 180 days. That 180-day school schedule is actually pretty unheard of. Right? Most
You
of the
actually, in
schools
your
are
presentations earlier, said it's actually truly only about 160 days. You measured that out.
160 full school days.
Exactly.
Yes.
So if we think that 180 is a baseline, why don't we go beyond that?
Because it eats into time that parents and families are used to having in summers, winter breaks, Thanksgiving breaks.
Those are assumptions. Have you actually surveyed them?
I have not. We can certainly ask the question, would you like to give up your summer and your breaks?
As a parent,
Yeah.
understanding the current situation? Absolutely.
Okay. Right. Your question makes me think that.
And that's what I'm
Yeah.
looking for, because you guys present yourselves as a world-class school district.
Mhm.
I don't necessarily see that. And when I see things like this, moving numbers on the margins, putting out blanket statements saying, yeah, we improved by 8 hours. What does that really mean? You think 8 hours in a classroom for students over the course of a year is going to be impactful, one way or the other?
I think that any increase of time in front of good teachers is always going to be impactful, yes. But you're right, 8 hours is not the same as what it was in 2016-17.
Yeah, I'll take a day over 8 hours.
Yeah.
I'll take 2 weeks more over 8 hours. Over 4 years.
Okay, yeah. I can't argue with the point that you're making. We're on the same page.
Okay.
More instructional time is better, but we have to weigh that against, the needs of the community and the viability of a teaching schedule. Right? So, in which we do on a pretty regular basis. When we get to the point of looking at a potentially alternate schedule, that's when we will do surveys and focus groups and all the other pieces that
Why are
we
we doing that now?
because we don't know what the schedule is. We can't say, I can't survey you about something that I have not formulated yet.
This is a post-COVID era. We recognize that this is not good enough. How much more time do you need to recognize to put a plan in place and ask the questions of what people want?
I apologize, and I'm not being oppositional. What is not good enough?
Look at your report cards. You just said yourself, the 38% proficiency scores coming out of South aren't good enough.
They
What
are.
are we gonna do to actively make that better?
I put it in that academic report. I spent 40 minutes talking to the board and weeks writing. I would suggest you look at all of the things that
That's
we're
why I'm
doing.
here.
Okay, so none of those things ring true?
I don't think you're doing anything yet that's really gonna make any difference to these students.
Okay.
I
Well-
think that's in the trend analysis over the last 6 years. I think you see the trend analysis in the scores so far.
Well, we'll continue to
So I
provide
guess
data.
that's part of my question is, and everything you're discussing here tonight, what is the expected improvement year over year?
More students pass all of their classes.
Is that the only metric? More? What's
Uh,
the one? That's like 8 hours.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can give you the most appropriate number, but yes, always more.
Okay.
Again, it's going to be different on every campus and with every group of kids. One of the most important points we made is that a cohort of kids changes over time, right? And that's why those scores sometimes, vacillate from one point to another. Right? We have to look at the kids, which is what we're doing with this MTSS program.
Okay.
So I'd like to put a wrap on this meeting, if we can. Be happy to hear any other comments or anything. Please send them to me by email. We can talk afterwards. And I want to thank Dr. Payne, Mr. McNear, Dr. Smith in the back of the room, and the 4 of you for coming. I do appreciate your comments and your thoughts. And when we don't agree, I think that we should keep talking. Right? I think we keep talking and we put some numbers to these ideas. Right? Because I would be happy to sit down with you anytime at all. Anytime at all. And we can talk about what we think are those goals, because I actually think that we have a lot of the data that you're looking for, and we can certainly talk about that.
Because that's honestly what I see, all of these things in the multi-tiered support system are good. Removing more instructional time out of the classroom day to accomplish it can be solved by a better schedule.
Agreed. Yes. That's the whole reason we're looking at it. Our current schedule does not work for the needs of kids in our school district right now.
What you're proposing, I don't think works out.
Which is what? Which part?
Their early release Wednesdays to essentially accomplish.
That's not what we're talking about.
multi-tiered
That's not what we're talking about. That's not that could be a component of a block schedule, but that's not what we've been discussing. Okay. Anything else?
Nope.
Thank you all for coming.
Good night. Thank you.
We'll see you next time.
We don't have one in December.
Um,
I mean, there's not even that many weeks.